In a high-stakes Senate hearing broadcast to 38 million viewers, Marco Rubio tried to humiliate Jasmine Crockett, questioning her competence and mocking her youth with a smirk meant to end the debate. But what he didn't see coming was the 200-page black folder she'd been building for weeks, armed with federal data, voting records, and financial disclosures that would flip the room on its head. One by one, she dismantled his legacy with surgical calm, exposing the cracks behind his so-called experience in front of a stunned chamber. The audience didn't just watch a debate, they witnessed a takedown. And now, as Rubio's silence speaks louder than any defense, one question echoes through every replay. How did a freshman congresswoman turn a veteran senator's moment of pride into his biggest political collapse? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Capitol hearing room was quiet, polished, and almost bored. Like a theater waiting for a play no one expected to matter. It was just another morning session on federal aid for small businesses, and reporters barely paid attention. Marco Rubio walked in with practiced confidence, navy suit crisp, speech folder tucked under one arm. He had just received a memo listing progressive threats. Jasmine Crockett's name was underlined. He smiled. A rookie like her wouldn't cause trouble. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Dressed in a storm gray blazer, she sat still, flipping through a thick black folder like she was preparing for court, not Congress. Her eyes didn't wander. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. She didn't need to speak to shift the atmosphere. Every movement was deliberate, like a clock counting down to something unseen. One of Rubio's young aides noticed. He watched her, uneasy, sensing something the room hadn't caught yet. Rubio brushed him off with a smirk. But the chamber's quiet had changed. It no longer felt routine. It felt rigged, tense, like something buried too long was about to surface. And this time, it had a name, a file, and a voice ready to burn through every layer of pretense. And then, the silence snapped. Marco Rubio rose with the slow, deliberate composure of a man who had done this 1,000 times and believed he had already won before saying a word. His fingers curled slightly around the edge of the podium, knuckles resting just above the microphone. His posture was flawless, his confidence weaponized. He cleared his throat, not because he needed to, but because it was a cue, a warning shot, the kind meant to silence the room before a strike. His voice came out smooth and controlled, measured like the edge of a scalpel. In this chamber, he began, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. We used to base economic policy on data, discipline, and real-world outcomes, not hashtags. There it was, the first shot fired. His gaze floated across the dais, avoiding direct eye contact with Jasmine Crockett, but orbiting her with surgical intent. He didn't need to name her. The implication clung to the air like smoke. Then came the line he'd rehearsed, polished, and probably tested with staffers for maximum sting. But now some seem to think you can balance a federal budget with a viral tweet. He let the words linger before stepping deeper into the attack. We have members here, he said, voice laced with that particular brand of mock respect, who, despite having served barely a year, believe they're ready to redesign the American economy from scratch. He folded his hands on the podium, tilted his head slightly, and added, experience matters, not just in winning elections, but in understanding consequences. This isn't a law school seminar. It's the United States Congress. And quite frankly, governing isn't something you improvise after a couple of floor speeches and retweets. The reaction was immediate, predictable. A few stifled chuckles erupted from the Republican bench. Low, dismissive, the kind of laughter that says, we know you don't belong here. It wasn't about economics. It was about place, about power. Rubio didn't smile. He didn't have to. The pleasure was in control, in commanding the moment like a conductor who believed he could silence any discordant note with a glance. And yet across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her face was still. Still like carved granite. She didn't furrow her brow, didn't scoff, didn't take the bait. She simply stared, straight at Rubio, not blinking, not retreating. watching him with the calm intensity of someone who had grown used to being spoken down to, underestimated, sidelined, someone who had sat through countless rooms where her voice had been treated like noise and her intellect like inconvenience. What Rubio misread as passivity was actually something far more dangerous: calculation. There was no panic in her, no shame, only silence that vibrated like a loaded spring. She was not reacting. She was remembering. And beneath the table, her fingers slid a single yellow tab onto a page inside her folder. A minor movement, barely visible, but it was the kind of detail that said, "You've just opened the wrong door." Across the hearing room, Democrats exchanged brief, uneasy glances. A few avoided eye contact altogether. They knew this playbook. They'd seen it before. Rubio, the seasoned orator, controlling the narrative with veiled barbs, dressed as policy critique. But there was something different this time, something sharper in the air. They could feel it, like the brief shift in pressure before a lightning strike. The room had gone colder, not because of what Rubio said, but because of how perfectly he believed she wouldn't respond. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't staying quiet out of fear. She was letting him finish digging, letting the arrogance deepen its own trench. Because some punches don't need to be dodged. They need to be documented. And some insults aren't answered. They're avenged. But Rubio wasn't finished. He just needed the cameras to blink. The gavel's echo hadn't even faded before the hearing room dissolved into a flurry of chair shuffles and side glances. Staffers leaned over to whisper last-minute updates, and senators migrated toward coffee stands or doorways, like it was just another bureaucratic breather. But for those who'd been paying attention, something unspoken lingered in the air, sharp, metallic. Marco Rubio loosened his collar slightly and stepped away from the podium with the satisfied air of a man who believed he'd just delivered the kill shot. He took a casual sip of water, turned slightly to his young aide, blonde, sharp-suited, still green enough to be impressed, and lowered his voice just enough to feign privacy. Then, with a condescending chuckle, he fired the line that would cost him more than any bill he'd ever voted for. "Honestly, it's a waste of time debating someone who still belongs in law school." He didn't flinch. He didn't whisper it in guilt. He said it like someone who had said it before and gotten applause. His tone wasn't even bitter. It was clinical, surgical, like he was assessing furniture, not a sitting congresswoman. And why wouldn't he? The room, the press, the seniority, it had always protected him. This was the voice of entitlement, seasoned by years of never being challenged by someone who looked like Jasmine Crockett. And to him, the insult wasn't a slip. It was truth dressed as cleverness. What Rubio didn't know, what his aide didn't know, what half the room had forgotten, was that the microphone at his station was still live. Hot. The CSPAN feed was still rolling, uninterrupted. No cut to commercial, no fade to black, just raw audio, broadcast nationwide, where a sitting U.S. senator had just dismissed a black woman with a Harvard law education as if she were a high school intern stumbling into the wrong building. A staffer at the tech booth jerked his head up, confused. Someone at the back whispered, "Is the feed still on?" But by the time hands moved toward kill switches, it was too late. The phrase had already left his mouth and entered history. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. Her eyes didn't widen. Her posture didn't shift. The only tell, so slight it could have been mistaken for a blink, was a faint tightening at the corners of her mouth. Not pain, not outrage, precision. Her hands rested near her iPad, unmoved. But then, with a quiet certainty that cut through the ambient buzz of chatter, she reached out and tapped the screen. Her fingers moved with intent. Not frantic, not reactionary. This was not a woman flustered. This was a woman keeping score. She didn't look at Rubio. She didn't give him the satisfaction of eye contact. Instead, she typed a new line beneath the file labeled "Hearing Notes." Rubio. 6 words. Measured. Chilling in their restraint. "He just gave me the headline." She hadn't expected respect. She'd expected resistance. But what Rubio had just done wasn't just rude, it was revealing. It confirmed everything she'd come to know about how power works in that room. The moment was no longer theoretical. It was live, documented, broadcast. And best of all, it was his. He'd handed it to her, like a man smiling while handing over the match, never noticing the pool of gasoline at his feet. And while Rubio smirked in ignorance, Jasmine Crockett began to load the chamber. She didn't flinch, didn't mutter a word, didn't roll her eyes for the cameras the way others might have. Emotion was a luxury, one she had long since been taught not to show in rooms like this. Instead, she reached into her leather satchel with the same quiet deliberation as someone unwrapping a weapon. Out came the black folder. Thick, heavy, no title, only a faint crease on the spine where it had been opened, studied, and annotated into submission. Over 200 pages inside, divided with surgical precision. On the left, Rubio's public statements, rallies, town halls, press hits, archived and time-stamped. On the right, his voting record, itemized line by line with red flags on economic contradictions. In the center, PAC contributions, including a suspicious one from 2018 that traced back to a healthcare contractor currently under federal investigation. Every document had a margin note. Every lie had a receipt. She didn't do this because she enjoyed paperwork. She did this because the system never gave women like her the benefit of the doubt, especially not black women with sharp tongues and sharper minds. She wasn't afforded mistakes. One misstep, one misquote, and they'd label her emotional, unprofessional, combative. So instead, she came armored in facts. Her fingers moved silently as she peeled a strip of yellow tape and marked a page in the middle of the PAC section. Just above a line that read, Rubio remarks contradict FEC filing, page 7, line 12. No one noticed. Not yet. The room was still humming with small talk and power posturing, but Crockett was building something, slowly, quietly, like the click of bullets chambering before the lights go out. And as the room returned to order, Jasmine Crockett rose, not to retaliate, but to recalibrate the balance of power. She didn't rise with the energy of a politician looking to score points. She rose like someone stepping into a role she'd rehearsed in silence for years, steeped in injustice, hardened by the knowing glances, the whispered dismissals, the ceilings she'd had to punch through just to stand here. There was no flourish in her movement, no dramatic pause for effect. Instead, there was a stillness, a deep, anchored calm that comes only when you've already survived worse behind closed doors. Her eyes did not search for affirmation. Her expression didn't shift to match the temperature of the room. She was not performing. She was correcting the record. Slowly, she placed one hand on the folder, her arsenal, and the other on the mic, steady as a surgeon approaching the first incision. I appreciate Senator Rubio for emphasizing the importance of experience. Today, I'd like to help him reevaluate his own. She said it plainly, not with venom, not with volume, but with such chilling clarity that the words seemed to hang in the air longer than gravity allowed. It wasn't a counterattack. It was a statement of purpose, delivered like a legal warning before the first exhibit is shown. Her tone didn't rise, but it cut through the room with precision. It wasn't defensive because she had nothing to defend. It was unmistakably judicial. Each syllable sharpened not for spectacle, but for impact. She sounded less like a congresswoman and more like a federal judge delivering notice. You're now under review. Around her, the energy shifted like a thunderclap with no sound. The casual murmur from the recess died in midair. Phones, once holstered, were now discreetly lifted, their red dots blinking live. Younger aides leaned toward one another, whispering names, nudging shoulders. Some of the senior members straightened in their chairs, sensing that what was coming next wasn't going to be politics. It was going to be precedent. For the first time all morning, the room wasn't watching the senator from Florida. It was watching the quiet fire standing in front of him. And though she never said it outright, her posture made the message plain. You called me unqualified. Now watch me qualify myself, using your own record. And then, without raising her voice, Jasmine Crockett pulled the pin. There was no shift in tone, no dramatic gesture, no need for volume. She simply opened the black folder with the care of someone unsheathing a blade honed over years of silence, condescension, and invisible labor. The pages inside weren't quotes or talking points. They were charges. Her fingers found the first tab, and without preamble, she began. In 2017, she said, eyes steady on the page, Senator Rubio supported a sweeping corporate tax cut, stating it would pay for itself through economic growth. She paused only long enough to flip the page, letting the sound punctuate the sentence like a gavel. According to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, it instead added $1.9 trillion to the national deficit. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The weight of the number, the finality of trillion, did all the damage necessary. She moved to the next tab with the same methodical control. In 2018, he endorsed tariff hikes on foreign imports, claiming it would protect American jobs and not burden consumers. She didn't look up. She didn't ask for agreement. She turned the page. Consumer prices rose 13% within 1 year, particularly on goods working families depend on. Each statement was a scalpel. Sharp, precise, unforgiving. Her voice was neutral but unwavering, the cadence of someone with nothing left to prove and everything documented. She let the facts breathe. No moralizing, no anger, just the cold elegance of proof. And still she continued. Another page, another strike. In 2019, she said, lifting a highlighter-marked page without flourish, he voted against a rural health care package, warning it would be fiscally irresponsible. She held up the sheet like evidence in a courtroom. Within 18 months, 32 rural hospitals shut their doors. The communities they served left without emergency care. Her voice didn't crack, didn't flinch. She wasn't dramatizing the collapse. She was indicting the cause. These weren't stats. They were scars. And she knew them intimately, not because she studied them, but because she had lived in communities like that, seen what policy looks like when it forgets who it's written for. Each source was immovable: CBO assessments, federal health data, Senate archives. Her delivery was judicial. It wasn't personal, it was prosecutorial. But the message couldn't have been more personal for the man across from her. Across the dais, Marco Rubio was no longer composed. His hand drifted to a loose stack of papers, searching without confidence, eyes flickering in uneven rhythm. He tried to align her words with the script in front of him, but the paper didn't match reality anymore. The narrative he'd carried into the hearing, crafted by advisors, rehearsed in green rooms, was crumbling under the sheer force of her preparation. His mouth tightened. His pen hovered above a blank line. He didn't write. He didn't speak. He sat there, caught not by emotion, but by math. Not by insults, but by receipts. And in that moment, he was no longer the man who mocked from behind a mic. He was the man being cross-examined by someone who'd brought the truth in black and white. And just when it seemed Jasmine had stripped every veneer of economic credibility from Marco Rubio's record, she let the silence breathe for just a moment. But then came the pivot, the shift, the escalation from performance to prosecution. With a calm precision that belied the stakes, she slid a second document from beneath the black folder. It wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of document that could turn a narrative into a verdict. Jasmine held it with the same care one might give to evidence pulled from the wreckage of a cover-up. Factual, damning, immune to denial. She raised it above the desk, letting the committee cameras catch it. Her voice, unhurried but razor-sharp, cut through the air with surgical intent. This is a Federal Election Commission filing from October 2018. She began, the words clinical, deliberate, as if she were reading the coroner's report for a political career. It shows that the Political Action Committee, Jobs for Growth, contributed $180,000 to Senator Rubio's re-election campaign. That figure, $180,000, didn't land like a number. It landed like a shadow over the room, the kind of figure that raises eyebrows not for its size but for its implications. Several heads turned, phones were discreetly raised again, thumbs hovered over record buttons. The calm unraveling had begun. She paused just for a breath, then lowered the page and added a new layer, one laced with something far darker than campaign financing. Now, this same pass is financially entangled with a private healthcare contractor currently under federal investigation for misappropriating COVID relief funds and unlawfully terminating frontline employees. The air chilled, not metaphorically, literally. The room felt colder, as if the temperature dropped in sync with the collective realization of what had just been said. Rubio's lips pressed into a thin, pale line. He didn't look at her this time. He looked past her, like a man scanning exits during a fire alarm he thought would never ring. One aide near the wall lowered their notepad, visibly swallowing hard. No one moved. No one dared to cut the silence. And then she stepped forward, not physically, but rhetorically, with a final sentence not meant to accuse, but to expose. Her eyes found Rubio's again, not challenging, not pleading, just stating what needed to be stated, like a surgeon speaking before the incision. "So let me ask you directly," she said, her tone quiet but unforgiving. "If my policies are what you call socialism, then what exactly do you call accepting campaign money from people who steal taxpayer dollars, Senator?" It was not a question. It was a gavel, time fractured. The silence that followed wasn't just stunned, it was paralyzed. Even Rubio's usual reflex, the smirk, the counter, the condescension, vanished. He blinked, not in confusion, but in disarmed recognition. He'd been hit, not by outrage, not by theatrics, but by something far more lethal in Washington. Precision armed with proof. No rebuttal came, no paper shuffled, no ally interrupted. The moment belonged to her. Not because she raised her voice, but because she raised the stakes. Because in a chamber where money often hides behind jargon, she dragged it into daylight and forced everyone to look. She didn't move to capitalize. She didn't need to. The silence had already spoken. The wound had already been opened. And every second Rubio didn't respond, it deepened. There are moments in politics that don't simply shift perception, they obliterate it. This was one of them. The atmosphere in the chamber had already turned brittle from the barrage of Crockett's revelations. But what came next was no longer a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. Jasmine's fingers moved with quiet purpose, tapping her iPad as if summoning the weight of years, not seconds. The tablet's screen glowed to life, casting a faint sterile light on her face. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't need to. The truth was about to speak for itself. With a calm, deliberate gesture, she turned the iPad toward the display interface. The large monitor behind her blinked once, then loaded a bar graph so devastatingly simple, it might as well have been a confession. 12%. That was the lone figure at the far end of a stark, silent chart. Beneath it, public economic statements by Senator Marco Rubio, 2015 to 2024. Factually correct? 12%. The remaining 88% was broken down into misleading, unsubstantiated, and false. Each category color-coded in shades that felt more like bruises than data. Each bar cut into the air like falling blades. Quiet, precise, undeniable. No voiceover, no spin. Just facts towering over the chamber like the judgment of a jury too tired to argue. She didn't pause for drama. She paused for discipline. Then she spoke. "If I am, as the senator implies, still too inexperienced." She enunciated every syllable like a scalpel tracing scar tissue. "Then what do we call someone who's been wrong 88% of the time and still gets to stand here as an expert?" It wasn't a question meant to be answered. It was a mirror held up to the room. Rubio didn't blink. He stared at the numbers, but his pupils had lost focus, as if searching the chart for a place to hide. His hand, once confidently steady on the podium, now hovered in indecision, fingers twitching like a conductor who'd forgotten the next note. There was no rebuttal, no smirk, just the ghost of a man watching the scaffolding of credibility collapse plank by plank. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was overfull. Too many thoughts packed into a space suddenly too small. Staffers shifted uncomfortably. Cameras zoomed in. Aides' pens froze midair. The Democratic bench held its breath, while even a few on the Republican side stopped typing, stopped whispering, stopped pretending this wasn't seismic. Crockett didn't press the moment. She didn't need to. Her face remained still, stone-carved in precision, her poise uninterrupted. She wasn't here to humiliate. She was here to unveil. And unveil she did, not just a senator's inaccuracies, but a system's reflex to elevate authority over accuracy, volume over truth. She wasn't shouting. She didn't have to. Because when you aim with facts, the silence becomes the loudest weapon in the room. And right now, silence was the only thing Marco Rubio had left. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's final question was not the kind that awaited a reply. It was the kind that waited for surrender. Rubio remained still for a moment too long, his eyes pinned to the data glowing behind her like a tombstone. His jaw clenched, but there was no resolve in it, only calculation. He understood now what had happened. He had walked into this hearing thinking he'd be giving a lecture. Instead, he had become the lesson. He rose, not with his usual confident spring or the theatrical energy of a practiced politician, but slowly, like a man inching away from wreckage he didn't want to admit he caused. His blazer bunched slightly at the shoulder, and his notes, once a shield, remained untouched. He looked neither left nor right as he reached for his mic, voice brittle, forced into formality. "I have a defense hearing at 3, he said. 9 words, empty, stale. Not a defense, but an exit strategy. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. And everyone in that room knew it. Senators, aides, interns, even the camera operators. They felt the air shift. This wasn't scheduling. This was retreat disguised as responsibility. Jasmine didn't blink. She turned her head slightly, watching him the way one watches a fire finally exhaust its fuel. And then, with a voice that held not bitterness, but irrevocable certainty, she delivered the sentence that would follow him out the door. "I understand. Not everyone has the courage to sit with the truth." There was no venom in it, no raised tone, just the kind of quiet conviction that echoes louder than shouting. Her words didn't strike like an insult. They landed like an obituary for a moment that could have been honest, but wasn't. A ripple ran through the room, soft, not explosive. A few members of the Democratic bench let their palms meet in measured applause, not for drama, but in recognition. Not celebration, but reverence. It wasn't about Crockett's strength alone. It was about what she'd endured to wield it with such grace. Rubio didn't acknowledge it. He turned toward the exit, back straight but rhythm off. Each footstep was fast but careful, like he couldn't decide if he was rushing away or hoping not to fall. His aides avoided eye contact. His silence trailed behind him like an unclaimed shadow. And then he disappeared behind the heavy oak door. No final glance, no closing remark. Only the sound of departure, only the feeling that he had walked in as a senator and left as a cautionary tale. Rubio's retreat didn't end the confrontation. It detonated a new war, beyond the chamber, into the hands of every reporter, editor, and citizen who had just watched power shift in real time. The headlines came like thunder after lightning, loud, relentless, and impossible to ignore. CNN's homepage led with a single, brutal line, "Marco Rubio, brought down by a folder." Beneath it, a still image captured the exact moment his authority fractured. Crockett standing with unshakable calm, a black binder in one hand, her eyes locked forward, while Rubio turned away, lips parted, the color in his face all but gone. The caption didn't need embellishment. The public had already seen what happened. The folder wasn't just a prop, it was a symbol, and America understood. The New York Times took a more surgical approach, PAC Secrets and the Rise of Jasmine Crockett. Their investigative piece laid out the timeline like a prosecution. They traced the PAC money, the corporate fraud allegations, and the systematic unraveling of Rubio's credibility, all done without raised voices or grandstanding. The article praised Crockett's performance as discipline disguised as grace, describing her method as cold, forensic, and devastatingly effective. The editorial board compared the moment to a political deposition televised in real time. It was the kind of piece that didn't just report, it rewrote the narrative of who holds authority on Capitol Hill. Even more conservative outlets struggled to reframe the damage. Fox News opened with the headline, "Truth or Political Sabotage." Their primetime segment debated whether Crockett had crossed a line, but even their own analysts couldn't deny the strength of her preparation. One guest reluctantly admitted, "I may not agree with her politics, but I can't argue with how she dismantled him point by point. It was surgical. Another voice attempted to deflect, claiming, this was political theater at its most dangerous. But no one watching could unsee the reality. The data, the votes, the money trail, it all came from Rubio's record. The coverage wasn't confined to pundits. Newspapers in Miami, Chicago, and San Francisco ran sidebars detailing Crockett's use of congressional reports, financial disclosures, and direct quotes. Even international papers picked up the story, running side-by-side columns about American accountability and the optics of gender, race, and power at play in a room not used to seeing them converge like that. One photo in particular swept across front pages. Crockett seated, chin slightly lifted, her finger resting on a page as she quoted directly from the Congressional Budget Office. The look on her face wasn't triumph, it was truth. That, more than anything, seemed to land with the public. She hadn't gloated. She hadn't raged. She had simply shown them the math and let the silence do the damage. And it was in that silence, now amplified by every network and newspaper, that something irreversible had happened. Jasmine Crockett hadn't shouted to be heard. She had prepared to be undeniable. And now, with the headlines echoing through households and offices alike, one fact was clear. She didn't just survive a political ambush. She rewrote the ending. And this time, it was Rubio who didn't have the last word. The air had not yet settled from Rubio's quiet retreat when the ripple began. First as whispers on political Slack channels, then as sharp-clipped footage shared by congressional interns on burner accounts. Within hours, the moment had become a national event. Jasmine Crockett's takedown, surgical and composed, had broken free from the hearing room's formality and spilled into the bloodstream of the internet. News outlets scrambled to catch up, but the digital masses were already there, replaying, remixing, and reframing the confrontation into an unmistakable symbol of power, truth, and reckoning. By the end of the first day, over 100,000 users had reshared video clips of the hearing. Some slowed down her opening lines, accentuating the calm ice in her tone. Others zoomed in on Rubio's blank stare as she recited economic data like it was a funeral liturgy. Political TikTokers turned her words into 30-second blows, setting them against orchestral builds and flashing headlines. $1.9 trillion deficit, 88% false claims, PAC tied to fraud. The post didn't need commentary. Her tone had already done the talking. Her calm was not silence. It was thunder trapped in velvet. On YouTube, commentators from across the political spectrum dropped emergency episodes dissecting the event. Legal analysts examined her sourcing, each citation aligned with Congressional Budget Office records and GAO reports. Economists followed her breadcrumb trail on corporate tax breaks and rural hospital closures, confirming the accuracy point by point. One journalist on MSNBC called it a masterclass in controlled demolition, except the building was a senator's entire economic credibility. Meanwhile, the meme economy exploded. One image showed Rubio mid-turn, walking away with the caption, "When the syllabus hits harder than expected." Another depicted Jasmine Crockett behind a lectern, iPad in hand, styled as a Marvel superhero poster titled, "The Auditor." But these weren't just jokes. They were digital verdicts, amplified echoes of a moment that had pierced through every filter. Late-night talk shows didn't miss the opportunity. One host quipped, "Rubio left so fast, TSA sent him a bill." But even beneath the comedy, there was a notable shift. They weren't mocking Crockett. They were quoting her. Line by line, her words, "Not everyone has the courage to sit with the truth," were replayed like an anthem. Not shouted, not barked, but spoken with surgical finality, the kind that sticks. The silence of Rubio in that room had traveled too, not just as a meme, but as a question. On political forums, Reddit threads lit up. Was this the end of Rubio's unchecked arrogance? Did Crockett just redraw the battle lines in public debate? People weren't just entertained. They were watching a power structure tremble in real time. One user commented, "She didn't just win, she rewrote the rules." Another, "If that's what inexperience looks like, we need more of it." And beyond the noise, the analysts came. NPR ran a segment titled, the rise of data-driven dissent, using Crockett's method as a template for a new kind of political engagement. Less shouting, more showing. A Harvard political science professor appeared on PBS saying, "What Crockett demonstrated was that facts, when delivered with restraint and precision, can still gut the room." She didn't perform outrage. She performed receipts. Campaign operatives took note. Whispers in D.C. campaign rooms grew louder. How to defend against someone like her? You can't outshout calm truth. You can't mock someone who isn't trying to be liked. The playbook they were used to, paint them as emotional, unqualified, overreaching, simply didn't land this time. Crockett hadn't played defense. She'd played court reporter, judge, and jury. All across the political spectrum, the shift was undeniable. Rubio's allies tried to spin the hearing as a cheap shot or grandstanding, but the footage undermined them. There was no shouting, no theatrics. Only a calm, clear voice backed by evidence and emboldened by dignity. And in that quiet precision, Crockett had accomplished what few do. She made silence feel like punishment. Beneath it all, something more permanent was unfolding. Not just viral reaction, not just headlines, but a reconfiguration of the narrative. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a newcomer anymore. She was a force, and the country was no longer asking if she had experience. They were asking what she would do next. The aftershocks did not end with laughter, headlines, or memes. The real damage began behind closed doors, where power speaks softly and cuts deeper. While social media erupted with praise for Crockett's composure and precision, another conversation was unfolding in rooms Rubio once commanded. And this time, no one was laughing. Within 72 hours, the first tremors hit his fundraising base. An email intended to finalize a $2.5 million commitment for Rubio's 2028 Exploratory Committee was abruptly canceled. The reason wasn't stated directly. It didn't need to be. The donor's political advisor left a single line in the reply: "Not the right climate for a visibility play." Others followed. 4 of his longtime corporate backers requested private reassessments of their sponsorships, citing strategic reevaluation of public alignment. Translated from donor speak, he no longer looked like a winner, he looked like a liability. Inside GOP leadership meetings, the air turned heavier. Rubio, once considered a near-automatic slot for major economic panels, was suddenly absent from 2 closed-door sessions. Whispers circulated that his role as the Republican voice on fiscal policy was being temporarily restructured. No official demotion, just the sound of chairs being pulled away. One senior Republican, caught on a hot mic, asked bluntly, "Do we really want him anywhere near Crockett again?" The strategy memos started shifting. Campaign teams were quietly warned to avoid direct confrontation with Crockett on economic matters unless absolutely necessary. A keyword search revealed her name had been added to 3 separate GOP opposition research lists, but under a new category, high-risk response. She wasn't just unpredictable, she was prepared. And worse for them, she was gaining traction with independents who once applauded Rubio's poise. At Fox Business Network, an analyst struggled to spin the fallout. "Senator Rubio remains committed to economic clarity," she said. But as she spoke, the clip of his silent retreat replayed in the lower third, creating a silent contradiction. The segment cut early. The silence once used as Rubio's rhetorical device now framed his undoing. The damage to his reputation wasn't theatrical. It was structural. For over a decade, Rubio had curated the image of being the adult in the room, policy-focused, sharp, in control. But Crockett's takedown hadn't come with shouting or insults. It had come with spreadsheets, voting records, and cold factual dissection. That made it worse, because it wasn't an attack, it was an audit. And in an age of political theater, nothing wounds deeper than undeniable truth delivered with calm authority. Republican strategists, watching the numbers, saw the shift. Internal polling from 3 swing districts showed a double-digit drop in Rubio's economic trust rating among voters over 50, his core base. Worse still, younger moderates, previously ambivalent about Crockett, now viewed her as disciplined, reliable, and credible. One campaign advisor called it the most precise credibility collapse we've seen since the pandemic hearings. Back in the Senate, Rubio's demeanor had changed. Once eager to chair hearings and deliver signature monologues on deregulation and trade, he had begun declining invitations. His name quietly vanished from the next economic policy conference in Atlanta. No announcement, just absence. A silence far more painful than any online headline. And unlike before, this silence was not strategic. It was protective. Some allies tried to salvage what they could. They floated op-eds painting Crockett as overprepared, as if her mastery of the facts was somehow a political flaw. But the public wasn't buying it. Each attempt to reframe the narrative only drew more attention to the moment they were trying to erase. Rubio, once immune to such setbacks, was now caught in a trap he didn't see coming. The truth wasn't fading, it was fossilizing. In Washington, reputations rarely fall from cliffs. They erode quietly. One missed briefing, one removed title, one hesitated endorsement. Rubio wasn't finished, but something in him, something carefully crafted over 2 decades, had cracked, and everyone in the building could hear it. The man who once stood with the confidence of certainty now walked with the calculation of survival. And while the party debated whether to shield him or replace him, Jasmine Crockett didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She had already changed the room, and Rubio had already left it. The vacuum Rubio left wasn't just absence, it was an opening. And Jasmine Crockett, steady as she was sharp, didn't walk through it. She claimed it. Not with glee, not with vengeance, but with the kind of precision that comes from knowing too well how rare these moments are, when the establishment's spotlight flickers and someone outside the traditional frame steps in with full control of her own light. Within 24 hours, Crockett's staff received back-to-back invitations from 5 of the biggest political talk shows in the country. Not the fluff segments buried at the end of the hour, but headline spots. CNN's The Point, MSNBC's Deadline, even 60 Minutes extended an offer for a feature on New Voices Transforming Congressional Discourse. Each request had the same theme. She didn't just survive the hearing, she rewrote its choreography. Producers scrambled for footage. Clips of her poised silence while Rubio unraveled were spliced with her clinical dismantling of his record. Each line delivered with surgical calm, no raise in volume, no loss of breath. The hosts weren't interested in scandal. They were fascinated by discipline, by the strange, elegant violence of truth delivered without theater. But it wasn't just television. 3 days later, Crockett was named keynote speaker at the upcoming National Youth Economic Conference, a gathering of over 8,000 young economists, activists, and business leaders under 35. The invitation was historic, not because she was young or black or a woman, but because this conference had never invited a freshman congresswoman, ever. She didn't accept immediately. She paused, reread the request, then replied with one sentence, "Let's talk about facts." The committee chair responded within minutes, "You're exactly who we've been waiting for." As the momentum grew, so did the reverberations. Progressive organizations from coast to coast released joint statements praising her performance, not for its drama, but for its refusal to perform. Jasmine Crockett, one publication wrote, has redefined congressional combat, not with insults, but with receipts. She was suddenly everywhere, not as a viral meme, but as a study case in leadership. The term evidence-based argumentation spiked in academic blogs. Graduate seminars dissected her strategy like a chess master's endgame. Every move deliberate, every silence weaponized. But beneath the surface praise lay something more tectonic, a shift in generational trust. For years, Capitol Hill had been ruled by projection. Who could speak louder, command longer, dominate stronger? Crockett did none of that. She didn't match Rubio's posture or tone. She dismantled it by rejecting the game entirely. The people noticed, and they weren't quiet about it. Social channels flooded not just with applause, but with something rarer, admiration laced with aspiration. Young activists began tagging her clips with lines like, "This is how you challenge power," and "More files, less filters." The American Political Science Review featured a rare mid-session column titled, "The Crockett Model, When Data Becomes Defiance." The title wasn't clickbait, it was acknowledgement. And then came the line that cemented it. From a panel of retired Senate historians on PBS, one professor leaned forward during a broadcast and said plainly, "What Jasmine Crockett did wasn't just political strategy, it was constitutional literacy at war with political branding." She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. The table fell silent. And the next day, that quote appeared on a hand-painted sign outside Howard University's law library under her photo. A student had posted it at 2:12 a.m., the time stamped on the Instagram reel. Beneath it, one word: blueprint. Meanwhile, inside the Beltway, a quiet dread spread through certain ranks. Veteran lawmakers, Democrat and Republican alike, began instructing their aides to triple-check speech drafts before hearings. Some even requested private briefings on legislative vulnerability mitigation. A sanitized way of saying, if Crockett gets the mic, make sure you're not holding a match. Her presence became the new control variable. The hearings didn't just change when she entered the room. They recalibrated. But Crockett wasn't parading. She didn't take victory laps. In every appearance, she refused to reduce what happened to a takedown or moment. She spoke only of precedent, of obligation, of the staggering responsibility to speak clearly and check one's facts. Because somewhere, someone is always listening who's never been invited into the room. On Face the Nation, she was asked how it felt to go viral for humiliating a senior senator. Her response was quiet but firm. "If I went viral for asking questions with citations, that says more about where we've been than where I'm going." The host blinked, moved on. But that quote would circulate for weeks, because it didn't feel like a clapback. It felt like curriculum. Within 7 days, Crockett's press team was fielding more offers than they could process. Universities wanted her for guest lectures. Book agents reached out. Documentarians requested access. But she declined nearly all, not because she feared the spotlight, but because she didn't come for it. Her mission wasn't attention, it was architecture. And in her view, real change required blueprints, not cameras. Still, not all praise came from friendly corners. In a rare moment of bipartisan awe, even conservative commentator David Brooks wrote a column in The Atlantic titled, "When Truth Punched Louder Than Pride." He didn't endorse her politics, but he called her a worthy opponent in a chamber starving for intellectual honesty. It was, in its own way, the highest compliment some could offer, fear laced with respect. Progressive think tanks started calling her the fact-right, a new term they coined for politicians who write their rebuttals in research, not emotion. She didn't embrace the title, but she didn't reject it either, because if the truth was finally making headlines, then maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. Not toward her, but toward something she'd long believed in: evidence as armor. Then came the most unexpected consequence. A quiet coalition of young congressional aides, Democrats, independents, even a few libertarians, began circulating an informal pledge. "We will fact-check before we flame." It started as an inside joke, a nod to Crockett's folder method, her tabs, her posture under pressure. But soon it caught on. Offices started redesigning briefing templates. A few even installed a new section on hearing prep forms. Public record cross-check, Crockett standard. She hadn't asked for any of this. She'd simply raised the bar by showing how low it had been. And as the dust settled and the media frenzy cooled, one thing remained unshaken. Jasmine Crockett wasn't a symbol of defiance. She was a signal, a warning, a recalibration. Because in a chamber long ruled by who shouted first or strutted loudest, a different kind of power had walked in quietly, opened a folder, and proven something radical. That sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one with the receipts and the patience to read them slowly. But even as the news cycles slowed and the talk shows moved on, something deeper continued to ripple, beneath the headlines, beyond the trending charts. It wasn't just Crockett's voice that had pierced the veil of Washington Convention. It was the way she wielded it. And for a generation too often told that credibility belongs to the loudest man in the room, her presence had become something else entirely. A proof of concept that truth, when timed correctly, doesn't need a microphone. It needs precision. That was the backdrop when James Carville, political strategist of 1,000 battles, took to his mic on the War Room podcast. The episode had been promoted as a general update on 2028 campaign narratives, but within the first 5 minutes, Carville detoured. With a half chuckle and that unmistakable Southern rasp, he leaned in and delivered the sentence that would live far longer than the broadcast. Rubio used experience like armor. Crockett used facts like a blade. In this era, blade cuts armor. The host paused, silent, absorbing. And then Carville added, almost as an afterthought but with piercing clarity, "There's a new language in that chamber, and she speaks it fluently." The episode went viral overnight, not because of fireworks or fury, but because a veteran of the old guard had just tipped his hat to the new. Not with reluctance, but with awe. Clips of the quote surfaced on TikTok, Reddit, and academic forums all at once. In a time when politics had become increasingly allergic to substance, Carville had identified the quiet revolution unfolding in plain sight. Crockett didn't just confront Rubio, she confronted a legacy. She didn't need to outperform him. She out-evidenced him. And in doing so, she rewrote the very dynamic of debate. University campuses caught on almost immediately. In one now viral classroom video at the University of Chicago, a political science professor paused his lecture and played the Carville clip aloud. When it finished, he turned to the class and said, "Forget spin. This is how the next generation will argue. Fact first, fearlessly." The students applauded, not out of fandom, but recognition. They saw themselves in her, not the bravado, not the spotlight, but the relentless preparation no one applauds until the moment it cleaves history in half. Meanwhile, high school debate coaches began circulating Crockett's hearing footage as instructional material. One coach in Atlanta revised the entire semester curriculum around what she called the Crockett cadence, a methodology of keeping one's tone steady while the facts do the escalation. Another in Austin redesigned her team's rebuttal drills, telling students, "Don't shout. Show. If you can cite it, you can strike with it." Even in corners of the political spectrum hostile to Crockett's policies, her performance was dissected with uneasy respect. Conservative-leaning blogs warned Republican staffers, "Come prepared. She won't attack you. She'll expose your spreadsheet." On the Daily Signal, a guest columnist, himself a former aide, wrote candidly, "We underestimated the power of order over outrage. And perhaps more tellingly, she didn't win the crowd. She made the crowd rethink what winning is." This wasn't about charisma anymore. This was about consequence. Inside Capitol Hill, the aftermath continued to unfold like silent aftershocks. Not in front of cameras, but in the cautious hush of staff meetings, in the quiet adjustments to hearing prep protocols. One longtime legislative assistant to a moderate Republican senator privately admitted, "We're tracking her folders now." She doesn't bluff. She prepares to the decimal point. But perhaps the most telling shift was generational. Young political hopefuls, once trained to deliver snappy sound bites or polished platitudes, now began studying source citations, budget line items, committee roll call data. And not because they were told to, because they'd seen what happens when someone uses facts as a weapon, not to destroy, but to define. Crockett had made the old-school weaponry obsolete. In its place, she left a blueprint that whispered, "Don't threaten, reveal." At a student forum at Howard University, a sophomore in a crisp gray suit stepped to the mic and said, "For the first time, I saw someone who didn't flinch, didn't flex, just unfolded the truth like it was evidence in court." Another followed with a simpler phrase, but one that summed up the era Crockett had cracked open. "You don't need volume when you have veracity." Across town, even think tanks began adjusting. The Progressive Policy Foundation launched a new initiative called Facts Over Fire, a mentorship and training program to develop emerging leaders in evidence-based public speaking. The pilot featured Crockett's performance as its opening case study, not just for her policy points, but for her posture, her restraint, the calculated risk of choosing quiet over spectacle, logic over legacy. Back on Carville's podcast in the days following his now iconic quote, listeners sent in questions by the thousands. One read, "What happens when more Crocketts rise? What happens to the Rubios?" Carville's answer was curt, almost tired. but devastatingly clear. What happens? They either adapt or get sliced open by someone holding the truth like a scalpel. The silence that followed wasn't dead air. It was reverence, because that was the crux of it. Crockett hadn't shouted Rubio down. She hadn't smeared him, insulted him, or made a spectacle of his defeat. She had simply out-researched him in real time, and in doing so exposed a vulnerability far more dangerous than political scandal: intellectual laziness. In a chamber that once prized pedigree over preparation, Crockett had made discipline fashionable again. And the message to every aspiring leader was clear: you don't have to wear a suit of armor if you carry a blade forged in facts. And in the silence that followed the storm, as Rubio's shadow faded down the marble hallway and whispers of disbelief continued to ripple through the Senate chamber, Jasmine Crockett remained seated. She didn't bask in the moment. She didn't smile for the cameras or celebrate like a warrior returning from battle. Instead, she quietly powered down her iPad, closed the black folder whose edges had become sharper than steel, and gathered her papers with the same grace she'd entered the room with. The chamber had changed, but she hadn't. Not in posture, not in pride, because this had never been about ego. This had always been about accountability. The lights hadn't dimmed, but the air felt heavier. Senators who had barely registered her presence days ago now leaned in, some whispering to aides, others scribbling notes. Not about policy, but about precision. They had just witnessed the anatomy of political truth-telling, not in volume, but in velocity, in structure, in control. Crockett hadn't merely survived an attack. She had reframed the battlefield. As she walked down the steps from the rostrum, several young interns stood in silent admiration. A few even clapped, not raucously, not for show, but as if acknowledging an unspoken oath being rewritten in real time. In a world where pageantry often drowned purpose, what they had seen was a blueprint for power rooted in something increasingly rare: earned clarity. Reporters outside shouted for comment. Microphones craned forward like weapons. But she didn't break stride. Her team knew the choreography by now. Silence, forward, precision. They flanked her just enough to protect her from the scrum, but not enough to hide her face. Because Crockett wasn't hiding anything. She never had. That evening, as footage of the confrontation continued looping across networks and newsrooms, rushed out emergency panels, Crockett sat alone in her office. The folder was still there, unopened now. The tabs still neatly organized. Blue for economic contradictions, yellow for ethics violations, red for PAC disclosures. But her eyes weren't on the pages anymore. They were on the people, on the calls that had come in from exhausted nurses in Missouri, thanking her for remembering rural hospitals, on the texts from single mothers in Detroit who had never seen a politician cite consumer inflation in the cost of cereal, on the email from a teenage debate student in Louisiana who wrote simply, "You made proof powerful." Then came the interview, pre-arranged, pre-recorded, a brief sit-down, framed modestly in a PBS studio, the kind of place where legacy gets documented, not amplified. The host asked gently, "What do you want people to remember from today?" Crockett looked straight into the lens. Her voice was calm, not theatrical, not indignant, but surgical, deliberate, like she was still inside the chamber, but speaking to every living room in America. "Not all experience is valuable," she began. "Only experience that's earned through accountability and truth-telling holds its weight. Preparation beats performance, and for far too long, we've been told to confuse confidence with competence. I don't care how many years someone sat in that chair. If they can't explain the consequence of their policies without deflecting or blaming, that's not experience. That's inertia." The host leaned back, visibly struck, but Crockett wasn't finished. "And I say this not with bitterness, but with resolve. The most dangerous phrase in politics is, 'We've always done it this way.' That's not legacy. That's laziness dressed in tradition. And it's killing real solutions." Then she closed the loop, the line that would headline editorial columns and be quoted in lecture halls for years. "Not all experience is valuable. Only the right experience, backed by evidence, delivered with integrity, can build something that lasts." There it was. No applause, No explosion. Just the truth, standing like bedrock beneath her words. The next morning, that quote was printed in 4 languages across global outlets. Le Monde called her the quiet storm from the American South. The Guardian described her as an emerging stateswoman who understands that conviction without data is just noise. And Der Spiegel simply called her the one who rewrote what power sounds like. But beyond the coverage, something deeper had shifted. Political consultants began revising their training slides. Universities requested licensing rights to replay her exchange with Rubio. A small nonprofit in Oakland started printing tote bags with the phrase, "Only the right experience matters." It was no longer just a quote, it had become doctrine. On the House floor 2 days later, Crockett returned to her seat like any other legislator. No fanfare, no entourage. But when she stood to speak again on an unrelated matter, this time about broadband expansion in rural communities, there was a stillness in the room. The kind of silence that comes only when people know what's about to be said will be remembered. And she said it, with numbers, with empathy, with references pulled from footnotes the average American had never seen. Not to show off, but to show up. And quietly, without thunder, without spectacle, she began setting a new standard. For herself, for the chamber, for the country. Because Crockett didn't just respond to a slight. She responded to an era. And in doing so, she proved a truth long buried beneath decades of polished speeches and hollow platitudes. That experience, if not tested, means nothing. That titles are hollow without traction. That when power and preparation finally meet, the room does listen, even when it doesn't clap. And as the headlines faded and the cameras turned elsewhere, what lingered wasn't just Crockett's tactical precision or Rubio's retreat. It was something deeper, something that seeped beneath the surface of politics and lodged itself in the hearts of those watching. Because behind every chart she presented, every number she weaponized, and every lie she dismantled, there stood a question that echoed louder than any applause. What is the price of being underestimated? That was the current running beneath the entire hearing, not just a battle of facts, but a reckoning of who gets dismissed and why. And in the echo of that reckoning came a lesson far bigger than either of them. Jasmine Crockett's victory wasn't cinematic because she embarrassed a senator. It was cinematic because she redefined how power could sound when wielded without rage, without vengeance, without apology. In a chamber where thunder often came from the loudest voice, she proved that storms could arrive in silence, built on patience, footnotes, and clarity. And if you were quiet enough, you could hear a generation learning that dignity isn't weakness, it's strategy. That composure under fire is not surrender, it's dominance in disguise. What Crockett showed that day was that real power doesn't announce itself, it prepares. The injustice she faced, the condescension, the subtle slights about her experience, the mockery when the microphones were assumed to be off, was not unique. It was systemic. It was the quiet rot baked into institutions that still confuse seniority with superiority. And yet she didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She demonstrated. For every woman told she was too emotional to lead, Crockett showed what emotional discipline looked like. For every black lawmaker silenced by technicalities, she turned those same technicalities into tools of precision. And for every rising voice cautioned to wait their turn, she answered without raising hers. That was the lesson, and it was human, not political. That when systems try to deny your credibility, you don't fight for attention. You fight with accuracy. You don't chase dignity. You defend it through discipline. Crockett didn't just beat Rubio in a room full of lights. She beat a mentality, a culture of dismissal. And she did it with a pen, a folder, in a voice that never cracked. What the country witnessed wasn't a debate. It was a demonstration of how preparedness is the great equalizer. That justice isn't loud, it's relentless. That being underestimated is no longer a curse if you're ready for the moment they let their guard down. Because they will. Eventually, they always do. And when they do, if you're ready, if you've done your homework, if your folder is tabbed and your sources are clean, then even giants fall without a scream. And still, Crockett never gloated. That's the part people miss. She didn't weaponize the moment for herself. She didn't turn it into a soundbite or a victory lap, because she wasn't fighting for revenge. She was fighting for correction, for recalibration, for the idea that truth, delivered with control, is more lasting than outrage delivered with fire. And in that choice, in her calm, her pause, her refusal to be baited, she became a mirror to everyone watching. A mirror that asked, what would you do if no one believed you could win? And you were right. The young interns in that room took note. The staffers watching from behind monitors took screenshots, not of memes, but of her posture, her stillness, her unshaken hands. Professors in law schools paused their syllabi to screen the hearing as a case study. Not in law, in strategy, not in rhetoric, in resolve. Because Crockett didn't prove herself just through facts, she proved that character, when tested under pressure, becomes sharper than data. And in the end, that's what stuck. The most human part of this story is also the simplest. She prepared. While others assumed, she annotated. While they whispered, she highlighted. While they talked over her, she listened under them. And when the floor was finally hers, she didn't waste it on bitterness. She used it like a surgeon, not to hurt, but to reveal the wound they'd ignored too long. So if there's one thing to take away, it's this. Be ready. Not because you expect fairness, but because you know it rarely arrives. Be quiet, not because you lack fury, but because silence sharpens it. Know your file, tab your folder, track every fact. Because when the moment comes, and it always comes, there's no power like being the one person who doesn't need to raise their voice to be heard. That's the real lesson of Jasmine Crockett. Not just that she won, but that she never had to shout to be unforgettable. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.